My parents spent 33 years calling me the family failure, the dumbest child who dropped out of college just to fix computers in a basement. They were so convinced of my worthlessness that they literally tried to throw me out of their own anniversary gala. But they did not know that a stranger was about to walk through those ballroom doors and hand me a $50 million check that would completely destroy their lives. My name is Kendall, 33 years old, and I am about to tell you how I legally dismantled my toxic family in front of 200 of their wealthiest friends. Before I dive into this absolute chaos, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to arrogant relatives who severely underestimated your worth. We were at my parents' 40th wedding anniversary gala at a massive rented estate in Palo Alto, California. The entire property was a masterclass in excessive wealth and carefully manufactured status. The grand ballroom featured floor-to-ceiling glass panels looking out over a meticulously manicured botanical garden illuminated by thousands of fairy lights. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar Wagyu beef sliders and tall flutes of vintage champagne. The floral arrangements on each table were towering, extravagant structures of white orchids and rare blue roses, costing more than what most people earned in an entire month. It was a monument to my parents' obsession with appearances. They had spared absolutely no expense to celebrate 40 years of a marriage that was in reality held together entirely by mutual vanity and joint bank accounts. I was seated at table number 4, purposefully placed away from the center of attention, but close enough to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I had just taken my first bite of the herb-crusted sea bass when a heavy leather-bound folder slammed down violently onto my porcelain plate. The impact shattered the delicate china and sent a splash of buttery lemon sauce directly onto my black evening gown. I slowly looked up from the ruined dinner to see my brother-in-law Jackson looming over my chair. At 36 years old, Jackson was a tall, strikingly handsome Black American man who wore his custom Italian suits like a suit of armor. He was the golden boy of the family, the charismatic tech startup founder my parents practically worshipped. He did not offer an apology for ruining my dress or destroying my meal. Instead, he tapped a manicured finger aggressively against the thick stack of legal documents resting in the mess on my plate. Power of attorney and asset transfer. He sneered, his voice loud enough to make an elderly couple at the next table pause their quiet conversation to stare at us. I need you to sign this right now, Kendall. Do not bother reading it, you would not understand the legal jargon anyway. Just sign your name on the dotted line. I wiped my cheek with a linen napkin, keeping my expression entirely neutral, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. What exactly am I signing, Jackson? I asked, my voice dangerously calm, amidst the bustling noise of the gala. He rolled his eyes, adjusting his expensive silk tie as if I were a massive burden wasting his precious time. It is a collateral assignment for Titan, my tech company. We are preparing for our Series C funding round, an eventual initial public offering, and the board requires a little extra padding to secure our latest bridge loan. We need to leverage that shabby, depressing little apartment you live in. It is not worth much, maybe a couple $100,000 on a good day, but the bank likes to see diversified, tangible assets. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his demand hang in the heavy air. You want me to sign over my home to fund your startup? I stated clearly. It is not a home, Kendall. It is a glorified shoebox. Jackson barked, leaning closer so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. And let us be honest, what do you even need it for? You are 33, entirely single, and fixing laptops for a living. You have no husband, no prospects, and absolutely zero financial literacy. The least you can do is make yourself useful to the people who actually matter in this family. The string quartet playing softly in the corner of the room seemed to fade away as Jackson continued his vicious verbal assault. He was playing to an audience, specifically the wealthy investors mingling nearby, trying to project the image of a ruthless, decisive chief executive officer handling a pesky, deadbeat relative. You are a college dropout, Kendall. He continued, his tone dripping with absolute venom. Your sister went to an Ivy League university. She is building an empire with me. Meanwhile, you spend your days doing what exactly? Troubleshooting wireless routers for confused old people, removing viruses from cheap hard drives. You are a glorified computer repair girl who still shows up to elite black tie events in off-the-rack dresses. Do you have any idea how deeply embarrassing it is for your parents to introduce you to these important people? Jackson fit right into this toxic world of smoke and mirrors. When my sister married him, my parents acted as if they had won the absolute lottery. He was the perfect accessory to their carefully curated lives. He had the charm of a seasoned politician and the aggressive, misplaced confidence of a con artist. He drove a pristine luxury sports car, wore limited edition luxury watches, and threw around words like synergy, disruptive innovation, and scalable paradigms at every single family gathering. He made sure everyone knew he was a visionary genius. But as I sat there looking directly at the man trying to bully me out of my only tangible asset, I saw right through his ridiculous facade. I noticed the small details he thought were perfectly hidden. The subtle, uncontrollable tremor in his hands. The thick beads of sweat forming along his hairline despite the heavy air conditioning blowing through the ballroom. The way his eyes darted nervously toward the grand entrance of the ballroom every few seconds, as if he was waiting for an executioner to arrive. Jackson was projecting absolute power, but he reeked of sheer desperation. He snatched a heavy silver pen from his inside jacket pocket and practically threw it at my chest. It bounced hard off my collarbone and clattered loudly onto the wooden table next to my broken plate. Sign it right now. My investors are looking for absolute family alignment. If I tell them my own sister-in-law will not back my brilliant vision, it makes me look weak. And I do not do weak, Kendall. I build the future. You just sit rotting in the basement of the present. I looked down at the document sitting on my broken plate. The top page was stained with fish grease and sauce, but the bold black heading was unmistakable. Unconditional release of property rights. It was not just a temporary collateral hold like he claimed. He was actively trying to take full permanent ownership of my home to liquidate it immediately for fast cash. He noticed me reading the header and scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively in the air. Do not strain your tiny brain trying to comprehend adult business matters. It is a standard operational clause. You will get your little apartment back when Titan hits $1 billion valuation early next year. Consider it a massive honor. You get to be a tiny, insignificant stepping stone in my massive legacy. He leaned his heavy palms on the table, effectively trapping me in my seat. I have tolerated your embarrassing presence in this family for 5 long years. I have smiled tightly while you brought down the collective intelligence of our holiday dinners. I have watched your poor parents bend over backwards to hide their deep disappointment every time someone asks what their youngest daughter does for a living. Today is the exact day you pay them back for their endless patience and charity. The audacity was almost impressive to witness. Jackson, a man who had never written a single functional line of code in his entire life, a man who built a tech company purely on stolen buzzwords and marketing campaigns, was lecturing me about intelligence. I knew exactly what Titan really was behind closed doors. It was a rapidly sinking startup with a terrible interface and a back-end architecture so fragile a gentle breeze could crash their servers entirely. But I had kept my mouth firmly shut for years, quietly observing his arrogance from the shadows, letting them believe they were the royalty of the tech world. But this was an entirely new, complete level of clinical delusion. He was not just asking for a small financial favor, he was demanding a complete sacrifice of my livelihood. I picked up the silver pen from the table, feeling its heavy, expensive weight in my hand. Jackson let out a smug, self-satisfied exhale, straightening his suit jacket, assuming he had easily won. He always assumed he had won when he aggressively bullied smaller people into submission. Just press down hard on the paper, he instructed, his voice oozing with unbearable condescension. There are 3 carbon copies underneath the main page. I need your initials on page 4, page 7, and your full legal signature on the back page. And do it quickly. I have actual important people to network with tonight. people who actually matter to the global economy. I held the pen loosely, refusing to sign, staring directly into his dark eyes. I watched the fake confidence begin to crack just slightly as the seconds ticked by in pure silence. I was about to drop the first match on his fragile house of cards. "Listen to me very carefully," he hissed, leaning down so his face was mere inches from mine, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You are a leech. You contribute absolutely nothing to this family's grand legacy. Penelope and I are the ones carrying the heavy weight. We are the ones funding the extravagant lifestyle, providing the social prestige, giving your parents something to actually brag about at the country club. My company is weeks away from a major industry breakthrough. We are going to change the entire world. And you are holding up my crucial timeline because you are too stupid to recognize a massive financial opportunity when it is literally shoved right in your face." I let him rant. I let him expose every ugly, entitled corner of his terrible personality, knowing his massive downfall was mere moments away. Before I could even open my mouth to respond to Jackson, a sharp shadow fell across the table. I reached for my crystal champagne flute, intending to take a slow, deliberate sip, just to watch the vein in his forehead pulse. But before the cool glass could touch my lips, a manicured hand dripping in diamond tennis bracelets shot out and physically snatched the drink right out of my grip. Some of the champagne sloshed over the rim, splashing onto the expensive white tablecloth. I looked up to see my mother Brenda glaring down at me with a look of absolute disgust. She slammed the flute onto the table so hard I thought the stem would snap. "What on earth is wrong with you, Kendall?" She hissed, her voice a tight, controlled whisper, designed to carry maximum venom without alerting the other tables. "Your brother-in-law is speaking to you about a crucial family investment, and you are sitting there smirking like an insolent teenager. Pick up that pen right now and do as you are told." My father Richard stepped up right behind her. He adjusted his custom tuxedo jacket, refusing to look me in the eye, choosing instead to stare at the ruined sea bass on my plate. He looked embarrassed, not by Jackson's aggressive behavior, but by my quiet refusal to immediately surrender. "Mom," I said evenly, keeping my hands neatly folded in my lap, "Jackson is asking me to sign over the legal deed to my apartment. He wants to use my home as collateral for Titan." "Do you actually understand what this document is?" Brenda let out a sharp, breathless laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Of course we understand what it is. We are the ones who told him to use it." That brief admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My own parents had orchestrated this ambush. They had offered up my only independent asset as a sacrificial lamb on the altar of Jackson's ego. "We need that bridge loan to clear Kendall." Richard finally spoke, his voice carrying the deep, authoritative rumble he used to close real estate deals. "Titan is positioned to disrupt the entire market. The initial public offering is only months away. But the institutional investors want to see skin in the game from the founders and their families. It shows unified confidence. We have already done our part, and now it is your turn." "Your part?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. Brenda leaned in closer, the heavy scent of her Chanel perfume momentarily overpowering the smell of the floral centerpieces. "Your father and I remortgaged this estate last month. We leveraged our retirement portfolio and the Palo Alto property to inject capital into Titan's Series C round. We put our entire legacy on the line for this family's future. The bank just needs a minor secondary asset to finalize the underwriting for the final loan. Your little apartment fits the exact criteria." I stared at them, letting the sheer financial reckless nature of their confessions sink in. My parents, who had spent decades meticulously building their wealth and lecturing me about fiscal responsibility, had literally bet their entire unencumbered estate on a tech startup that produced nothing but empty buzzwords. They were completely blinded by Jackson's expensive suits and Penelope's grand promises of becoming Silicon Valley royalty. "You remortgaged your home for a company that does not even have a functioning flagship product," I stated flatly. Brenda's eyes flashed with pure fury. She placed both of her hands flat on the table, her perfectly painted red nails digging into the white linen. This was the moment she abandoned any pretense of being a loving mother and resorted to the psychological warfare she had perfected over 3 decades. Do not you dare sit there and pretend you know anything about business. She spat, her voice trembling with indignant rage. You have no right to question Jackson or Penelope. You have no right to question us. What do you know about building a legacy? Look at your life, Kendall. Just look at it. You are 33 years old and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. She pointed a shaking finger at my face. When your sister was your age, she had already secured her second promotion at a top-tier marketing firm and married a visionary. She graduated top of her class at Harvard, while we were busy making excuses to our friends about why you decided to drop out of state college. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to tell the country club board that our youngest daughter fixes computer glitches for minimum wage while her sister is dining with senators? I do not work for minimum wage, Mom, I replied softly, though I knew facts would not penetrate her delusion. Oh, please, Brenda scoffed loudly, waving her hand as if swatting away a fly. You hide in your dark little apartment writing code nobody cares about. You have always been so difficult, Kendall. So stubborn and entirely useless to this family. When you failed out of your degree program, did we abandon you? No, we let you figure it out. But you never figured it out. You just settled for mediocrity. Penelope is carrying this family into the next social stratosphere, and you are dragging like a dead weight around our ankles. The gaslighting was so textbook it was almost theatrical. She conveniently left out the part where she had actively hidden my acceptance letter to a prestigious technology institute when I was 18, claiming they could not afford the tuition because they had just bought Penelope a brand new luxury car for her graduation. She left out the fact that I dropped out of state college because I had already surpassed the curriculum and started anonymously contracting my security software to corporate clients. To them, my silence about my wealth equated to failure. They needed me to be the failure so Penelope could shine brighter. Richard placed a heavy hand on Brenda's shoulder, taking over the assault with a different tactic. Where Brenda used pure venom, my father used the heavy crushing weight of familial obligation. Kendall, listen to reason, he said, adopting the disappointed tone he used to make me cry when I was a child. We gave you everything. We paid for your braces. We put clothes on your back. We gave you a roof over your head in one of the most expensive zip codes in the country. You owe us for the life you have enjoyed. Family is about sacrifice. Jackson and Penelope are on the verge of making hundreds of millions of dollars. When the company goes public, Jackson will buy you a house twice the size of your current place. He will set you up with a trust fund. But right now we need you to be a team player. Stop being so deeply selfish. Selfish. I repeated the word slowly, tasting the bitter irony of it. You want me to sign away the only thing I own to secure a loan to protect the house you foolishly remortgaged for a brother-in-law who openly disrespects me, and I am the selfish one. Yes, you are, Brenda snapped immediately, because you are only thinking about your tiny, pathetic little bubble. You are not thinking about the family bloodline. Jackson and Penelope are trying to start a family next year. They are building a dynasty. What are you building, Kendall? Nothing. You will never have what they have. The absolute least you can do, the bare minimum as a daughter of this family, is to provide the collateral they need to secure their future. It is time for you to finally be useful to us. She reached down, grabbed the silver pen from the table, and aggressively shoved it against my palm. The cold metal pressed sharply into my skin. Sign the paper, she demanded, her eyes wide and manic with desperation. Sign it right now, or so help me, you will not leave this room as a member of this family. We will cut you off completely. No holiday dinners, no inheritance, no emergency support. You will be entirely on your own. They really thought this was the ultimate threat. They truly believed that the prospect of losing their toxic company would break my spirit and force me into submission. They thought I was a terrified, fragile little girl who desperately craved their conditional validation. I looked at Jackson, who was standing behind them, with a triumphant, sickening smirk plastered across his face. He loved this. He loved watching my own parents rip me apart to protect his fraudulent empire. He mouthed the words, "Just sign it," from over my father's shoulder. I looked at my father, whose face was completely hardened, prioritizing his financial gamble over his own flesh and blood. And then I looked at my mother, who was breathing heavily. her face flushed with anger, holding the pen against my hand as if she were trying to stab me with it. I did not take the pen. Instead, I let my hand drop to my lap. I leaned back in my chair, smoothing out the fabric of my dress where the lemon sauce had spilled. A strange, serene calmness washed over me. This was the moment I realized I owed them absolutely nothing. The guilt they had programmed into me for 33 years evaporated completely in the span of 5 seconds. Mom, I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion, cold and echoing in the tight space between us. You remortgaged this house to fund Titan. Tell me, did Jackson happen to mention what the Securities and Exchange Commission is currently doing with Titan's financial ledgers? The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda frowned, her hand slowly pulling the pen back. Richard's brow furrowed in deep confusion, and behind them Jackson's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda frowned, her hand slowly pulling the pen back. Richard's brow furrowed in deep confusion, and behind them Jackson's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. Jackson swallowed hard, a visibly loud gulp that made his Adam's apple bob frantically against his tight silk collar. The confident, commanding aura he had projected just moments ago completely evaporated. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and suddenly realized there was no safety net below. A thick bead of sweat broke out near his left temple, catching the sparkling light of the overhead chandeliers. "What are you talking about?" Brenda asked, her voice losing its aggressive edge, replaced by a sharp note of genuine uncertainty. She looked back and forth between me and Jackson, her diamond earrings swaying with the frantic movement of her head. "Jackson, what is she talking about? What is the SEC doing?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, completely unbothered by the growing tension. "The Securities and Exchange Commission, Mom. They govern the financial markets, and right now they are heavily scrutinizing Titan's Series B financial disclosures. Specifically, the discrepancies in their reported user acquisition metrics and the sudden appearance of phantom revenue on their ledgers." "Shut up," Jackson finally managed to choke out. His voice cracked, losing its deep, authoritative resonance. He took a step forward, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are making things up. You are pulling completely baseless accusations out of thin air just to ruin this night." I did not flinch. I picked up the linen napkin from my lap and carefully wiped a small, greasy smudge of caviar off the corner of the unconditional release of property rights document. I smoothed the thick paper out on the table, treating it with more respect than I was treating my brother-in-law. "Am I making it up, Jackson?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of an absolute conviction. "Then explain why federal investigators seized the servers at your downtown office last Tuesday at exactly 6 in the morning. Explain why your chief financial officer abruptly resigned 3 days ago and fled to an undisclosed location. Explain why the lead investors from your last funding round have frozen all remaining capital injections pending a forensic accounting review." Richard's face drained of all color. He looked at Jackson, his eyes wide with a sudden horrifying realization. "Jackson, tell me she is lying," my father demanded, his voice thick with rising panic. "Tell me you did not leverage my home, my entire retirement fund on a company that is being investigated by federal authorities for fraud. Tell me the servers were not seized." For a terrifying 5 seconds, Jackson stood frozen. He looked at the surrounding tables, realizing that several important guests, including a local senator and 2 prominent venture capitalists, were beginning to actively stare at our unfolding drama. His pristine reputation was hanging by a single frayed thread. And then I watched the survival instinct kick in. Jackson was a cornered animal, and cornered animals do not surrender. They attack. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely unnatural. He clapped his hands together, shaking his head, as if I had just told a highly amusing but entirely ridiculous joke. He physically puffed out his chest, stepping back into the light of the chandelier to regain his commanding presence. "Oh my God, Kendall, you really are completely delusional," Jackson announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the neighboring tables. He turned to Richard and Brenda, putting his hands reassuringly on their shoulders. Richard, Brenda, please. Do not listen to a word this paranoid girl is saying. She has been reading too many internet conspiracy theories again. But what about the federal investigators? Richard pressed, though his voice was already wavering, wanting desperately to believe Jackson. What about the servers? Jackson rolled his eyes dramatically, adopting a tone of deep patronizing patience. It is a routine compliance check, Richard. Jesus Kendall, you really have absolutely no idea how high-level corporate finance works, do you? When a startup like Titan prepares for a massive public offering, the SEC conducts standard due diligence audits. They review our algorithmic anomalies, assess our burn rate against our projected EBITDA, and verify our data encryption protocols. It is completely standard procedure for any unicorn company valued at over $500 million. He leaned over the table, staring me down with a look of pure aggressive malice. We voluntarily surrendered a backup server to the compliance officers to expedite the security clearance, and my chief financial officer did not flee. He took a planned medical leave of absence because of the immense stress of preparing for our IPO, which, by the way, is still completely on track to make this family incredibly wealthy. Brenda let out a massive, shaky sigh of relief. The color returned to her face, and the diamond tennis bracelets clinked against the table as she leaned heavily onto the wood. She wanted to believe him. No, she needed to believe him. The alternative was simply too terrifying for her fragile status-obsessed ego to process. If Jackson was a fraud, then she and Richard were destitute. They would lose the country club memberships, the luxury cars, and the respect of their wealthy peers. They would be ruined. So they chose the comfortable lie over the devastating truth. I knew it, Brenda snapped, turning her furious gaze back onto me. The brief moment of uncertainty was completely gone, replaced by a renewed, blinding hatred. I knew you were just trying to sabotage him. You are so violently jealous of your sister's happiness that you would invent federal crimes just to create chaos at my anniversary dinner. Mom, he is lying to your face, I stated calmly, though I knew it was entirely useless. He is using buzzwords to confuse you. A routine compliance check does not involve unannounced morning raids. A planned medical leave does not happen the exact same day investor funds are frozen. He is sinking, and he is trying to use my apartment as a tiny lifeboat before the entire ship goes underwater. Enough, Richard bellowed, slamming his fist down onto the table. A nearby waiter jumped, nearly dropping a tray of champagne glasses. Richard pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. I will not sit here and listen to you slander the man who is trying to elevate this family. Jackson is a visionary. He understands complex market paradigms that you could not possibly comprehend. I almost smiled at how seamlessly my father had regurgitated Jackson's ridiculous corporate vocabulary. Market paradigms. It was terrifying how easily manipulatable my parents were when the promise of extreme wealth was dangled in front of them. You are a bitter, ungrateful child, Brenda added, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. You sit in your dark room fixing broken computer fans, and you think you understand how the real world operates. You think you can read a few fake news articles online, and suddenly you are an expert in venture capital and corporate law. You know absolutely nothing, Kendall. You are a failure trying to drag successful people down to your miserable level. Jackson stood tall behind them, looking down at me like a conquering king. The sweat was still on his brow, but his breathing had steadied. He had successfully manipulated my parents back into his corner. He had weaponized their own greed against my warnings. Just sign the document, Kendall Jackson commanded, his voice dark and threatening. Sign it, and we will forget this embarrassing little outburst ever happened. Do it for your parents. Do it to prove you are not the complete waste of space everyone in this room knows you are. I looked at the unconditional release of property rights. It was a legally binding document that would give Jackson the power to instantly sell my home. He needed cash rapidly to pay off the furious investors who were threatening to press criminal charges, and he was willing to leave me homeless to buy himself a few more weeks of freedom. I picked up the heavy silver pen. Brenda leaned forward, a greedy, expectant look in her eyes. Richard crossed his arms, nodding in stern approval. Jackson smirked, assuming he had finally broken me down with his aggressive psychological assault. I brought the pen to the paper, but instead of signing my legal name, I deliberately and forcefully drew a massive, thick black line straight through the signature box. I pressed so hard the ink bled through the carbon copies beneath it, completely voiding the entire contract. "No," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the soft classical music playing in the background. Brenda gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Richard's jaw dropped. I picked up the ruined document and slid it back across the table until it hit Jackson's chest. "I will not give you my home, Jackson. I will not fund your fraudulent lifestyle. And I will not protect you when the federal agents come back to arrest you." Jackson's eyes widened in absolute fury. He grabbed the voided contract, his knuckles turning white as he crumpled the thick paper in his fists. He looked as though he was going to lunge across the table and physically attack me right there in the middle of the crowded ballroom. But before he could unleash his rage, a new voice cut through the heavy, toxic atmosphere. A high-pitched, overly sweet, and incredibly dangerous voice that I had known my entire life. "What on earth is going on over here?" I slowly turned my head. Walking toward our table wearing a stunning red designer gown and an expression of pure condescending authority was my older sister, Penelope. The golden child had finally arrived to protect her husband, and she was bringing 33 years of accumulated venom with her. Penelope stopped directly beside Jackson, sliding her arm through his and resting her perfectly sculpted chin against his shoulder. Her eyes, identical to our mother's, but entirely devoid of any warmth, scanned the crumpled document Jackson still held in his tight fist. She looked at the ruined sea bass on my plate, then at the thick black line I had drawn through the signature box. Her perfectly painted red lips curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. She wore a stunning custom-tailored crimson evening gown that clung to her figure, aggressively demanding the attention of every single person in the room. She was the absolute picture of high society elegance, but the expression on her face was pure, unfiltered malice. "What is this, Kendall?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the gala like a serrated knife. "Why is my husband standing here looking like he is about to have a panic attack? Why is our father red in the face? What exactly have you done to ruin my parents' anniversary?" Jackson leaned down and whispered frantically into her ear, playing the victim with practiced, sickening ease. "She refuses to provide the collateral penny, and she is making up wild, psychotic lies about federal agents raiding my office to terrify your parents into backing out of their investment." Penelope did not even blink at the mention of federal agents. Her absolute blind faith in her husband was staggering. She turned her vicious gaze entirely on me, stepping away from Jackson so she could physically loom over my chair. "I should have known." Penelope sighed heavily, crossing her arms over her chest. "I told Mom and Dad not to invite you tonight. I explicitly told them that you would find a way to make this entire evening about your own miserable, pathetic little life. But they insisted. They said, 'Let us give Kendall a chance to be part of the family for once. Let us pretend we have two successful daughters. And this is how you repay their incredible generosity.'" "I am not making anything up, Penelope," I replied, keeping my voice steady and refusing to shrink back from her imposing posture. "Your husband is committing severe corporate fraud. He is desperately trying to steal my home to cover up his massive financial crimes before the authorities freeze his personal assets." Penelope let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed loudly enough to make the string quartet momentarily lose their rhythm. "Corporate fraud. Are you actually insane, Kendall? Do you hear yourself right now? You are a 33-year-old woman who lives in a glorified closet and spends her weekends resetting passwords for confused senior citizens. You do not even possess the basic vocabulary required to understand what Jackson does, let alone accuse him of international financial crimes." This was the dynamic we had been securely locked into since childhood. Penelope was the undisputed golden child, the shining beacon of absolute perfection who could do no wrong. She had the Ivy League education, the wealthy tech executive husband, the designer clothes, and the complete, unwavering adoration of our parents. I was the designated scapegoat, the dark cloud they could blame for every single minor inconvenience. If something went wrong in our family, it was inherently my fault. because I was the defective, disappointing child. You are just jealous. Penelope continued, her voice rising in pitch as she worked herself into a familiar self-righteous fury. You have always been violently, pathetically jealous of me. You cannot stand the fact that I married a brilliant, successful man who is building a massive global empire. You cannot stand the fact that Mom and Dad respect him more than they have ever respected you. So you sit in your cheap little apartment and you invent these ridiculous fantasies where Jackson is a criminal and you are the brilliant whistleblower trying to save the day. It is pathetic, Kendall. It is deeply, genuinely sad. She leaned closer, placing both of her manicured hands flat on the table, her face mere inches from mine. Let me explain reality to you, since you clearly lost your grip on it years ago. Titan is going to be a billion-dollar company. Jackson is going to ring the bell at the New York Stock Exchange. We are going to buy a private island. We are going to fly on private jets. And you are still going to be exactly where you are right now. A bitter, lonely, uneducated girl with zero ambition and zero future. I looked at my sister, taking in the expensive diamonds glittering at her throat, and the heavy designer watch resting on her wrist. All of it paid for by the stolen money of innocent investors. Penelope, I said quietly, keeping my composure. Have you actually looked at his financial statements? Have you seen a single legitimate profit and loss report that was not drafted by his own internal marketing team to look pretty on a presentation board? Do not you dare speak to me as if we are equals, Penelope snapped, slamming her palm violently onto the table. The silverware rattled against the broken porcelain. I went to Harvard. I hold a master's degree in business administration. You dropped out of a mediocre state college because the introductory courses were too difficult for your tiny brain to process. You have absolutely no right to question my husband's business acumen. And there it was. The ultimate weapon she always kept fully loaded in her arsenal. My supposed intellectual inferiority. Penelope loved to remind me of my academic failures at every possible opportunity. She thrived on the completely fabricated narrative that she was the undeniable genius, and I was the slow, disappointing burden that dragged the family name through the mud. It is the exact same jealousy I saw when we were teenagers. Penelope sneered, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading slowly across her face. She was preparing to deliver what she believed was the killing blow. Do you remember the day the college acceptance letters arrived in the mail, Kendall? Because I remember it vividly. I remember walking into the kitchen and seeing you sitting at the granite island, sobbing your eyes out over that tiny, thin envelope from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. My parents shifted uncomfortably behind her, but they remained entirely silent, allowing Penelope to aggressively tear open the deepest, most painful wound of my adolescence. They stood back and watched their golden child brutalize their scapegoat, fully endorsing the emotional violence. You actually thought you were smart enough to get into a top-tier engineering program? Penelope laughed, shaking her head in mock disbelief. You really believed that hiding in your bedroom, playing with cheap circuit boards and typing code into the early hours of the morning made you a genius. And then, brutal reality hit you right in the face. The admissions board saw exactly what I have always seen. You are exceptionally average. You are unremarkable in every conceivable way. I remember placing my thick, heavy acceptance packet from Harvard right next to your pathetic little rejection letter. I remember the look of utter defeat on your face when Mom and Dad popped an expensive bottle of champagne to celebrate my bright future, while you had to sit there in silence and swallow your massive failure. She traced a long finger along the rim of the empty champagne flute my mother had snatched from me earlier. You have never forgiven me for that day, have you? You have spent your entire adult life resenting my success, because it constantly reminds you of your own glaring inadequacy. That is why you are doing this tonight. You want Jackson to fail because you want me to finally know what it feels like to be a massive, humiliating disappointment. You want to drag me down to your miserable level so you do not have to feel so incredibly inferior all the time. Her words were explicitly designed to completely crush my spirit and force me into total submission. 10 years ago, that exact speech would have sent me running from the ballroom in humiliated tears. I would have internalized every single vicious insult and genuinely believed that I was truly worthless. I would have believed that my only value was what I could sacrifice for them. But tonight, sitting in that opulent room, knowing the monumental secret I was holding quietly in my mind, her words sounded incredibly hollow. They were nothing but the desperate, cruel ramblings of a woman whose entire identity was dangerously tied to a fraudulent narrative. What Penelope did not know, what none of them knew, was the actual truth about that rejection letter. They did not know that I had found the real letter, the thick acceptance packet offering me a full academic scholarship to the engineering program, hidden at the bottom of my mother's locked filing cabinet 5 years later. They did not know my mother had intentionally forged a rejection letter because she could not stomach the idea of her defective child attending a more prestigious university than her perfect golden daughter. But I did not need to expose that deeply buried truth right now. I had a much larger, much more devastating reality to deliver to them today. "You are entirely right, Penelope," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and completely unfazed by her brutal emotional assault. "I do not have a Harvard degree, and I do not care about your champagne celebrations or your designer clothes. But what I do deeply care about is the fact that you are standing here aggressively defending a man who has secretly leveraged your entire life to pay off his rapidly mounting debts." Penelope paused, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "What are you talking about?" I looked past her, making direct eye contact with Jackson, whose face was now completely devoid of color. "Did you tell her, Jackson? Did you tell your brilliant Ivy League-educated wife that you used her forged signature to co-sign the secondary mezzanine loans? Did you tell her that when the Securities and Exchange Commission officially freezes Titan's corporate assets next week, they are also going to seize her personal bank accounts, her designer cars, and the massive trust fund her parents set up for her?" Jackson lunged forward, grabbing Penelope by the upper arm and roughly pulling her back from the dinner table. "Stop talking to her, Penny. She is trying to get inside your head. She is trying to divide us. We need to leave right now. We will find another way to secure the bridge loan. Richard, Brenda, we are leaving. This environment is completely toxic, and I will not let my wife be disrespected by this lunatic." He was absolutely panicking. He was actively trying to drag his wife away before I could expose the terrifying depths of his betrayal. But Penelope yanked her arm violently out of his grasp, her perfectly manicured facade cracking for the very first time tonight. She looked at Jackson, then back at me, finally sensing the genuine, uncontrollable panic radiating from her supposedly fearless husband. "What secondary loans?" Jackson Penelope demanded, her voice suddenly losing its arrogant, condescending edge. "You told me the Series C funding was completely secured. You told me our personal assets were entirely shielded." Before Jackson could formulate another complicated lie to pacify his suddenly suspicious wife, my father stepped aggressively forward, his face dark with absolute rage. He had reached his absolute limit. He did not care about the federal investigations. He did not care about the secondary loans. He only cared about the fact that I was actively refusing to obey his direct orders and causing a public scene. And in his rigid world, disobedience from his least favorite child was the ultimate unforgivable crime. Richard did not care about Penelope's sudden realization. He raised his right hand high above his head and snapped his fingers with a sharp, echoing crack that cut through the remaining ambient noise of the ballroom. The string quartet in the corner finally stopped playing altogether, the cellist resting his bow on his knee as he openly stared at our table. From the shadowy perimeter of the room, 4 massive men in identical black suits and discreet earpieces immediately detached themselves from the walls and began marching directly toward us. They were the private security detail my father had hired for the gala men trained to handle unruly paparazzi or uninvited guests. And now my own father was calling them in to handle his youngest daughter. The heavy thud of their polished shoes on the marble floor sounded like a slow, rhythmic drumbeat of an impending execution. The wealthy guests at the surrounding tables fell completely silent, their expensive meals forgotten, as they watched the patriarch of the family prepare to publicly destroy his own child. Jackson stepped back, letting my father take the absolute center stage, a cowardly move that allowed him to hide behind the older man's terrifying wrath. Penelope also went silent, her previous questions about secondary loans temporarily swallowed by the sheer shock of seeing our father escalate the situation to physical force. "You have pushed me too far tonight, Kendall," Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that I had only heard a few times in my entire life. It was the voice he used when he was about to completely annihilate a rival business. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face as the 4 security guards formed a tight, intimidating circle around my chair. "I have spent my entire life building this family name. I have poured millions of dollars into ensuring that we are respected, feared, and admired in this community. I will not allow a stubborn, ungrateful failure of a child to tear down everything I have built simply because she is throwing a jealous tantrum." He leaned down, placing both of his heavy hands on the table, invading my personal space, until I could see the furious blood vessels popping in the whites of his eyes. "I am going to make this incredibly simple for you, Kendall. You have exactly 60 seconds. Jackson has a blank copy of that unconditional release of property rights in his briefcase. You are going to take that silver pen and you are going to sign your full legal name on every single dotted line. You are going to hand over the deed to your apartment, and you are going to apologize to your sister and your brother-in-law for the ridiculous, slanderous lies you just spewed about federal investigations. And if I refuse," I asked, my voice remaining eerily calm, despite the towering men standing just inches from my shoulders. "Then you are no longer my daughter," Richard stated with absolute terrifying finality. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Brenda stood right beside him, her face a mask of cold, unyielding stone. She did not flinch. She did not reach out to soften the blow. She fully supported his decision to surgically remove me from their lives. "If you do not sign that paper right now, you are completely dead to me." Richard continued, each word striking like a hammer against an anvil. "I will call my estate lawyer first thing tomorrow morning and have you permanently struck from my will. You will not receive a single dime of my money. You will not receive a single piece of property. No trust fund, no family heirlooms, nothing. I will completely erase you from the financial legacy of this family. And tonight, right here in front of all my friends and colleagues, I will have these men physically drag you out of this ballroom and throw you onto the street like the trash you are acting like." He pulled back his sleeve to reveal his expensive luxury watch, tapping the glass face with his index finger. 60 seconds, Kendall. The clock is ticking. Decide right now if you want to be a member of a wealthy, powerful family, or if you want to be a penniless orphan walking home in the dark. It was the ultimate ultimatum. It was the absolute pinnacle of their toxic parenting strategy, the final desperate move to crush my spirit and force me into total compliance. They genuinely believed that the threat of losing their money and their conditional love would terrify me into submission. They thought I would burst into tears, beg for their forgiveness, and eagerly sign away my only asset just to stay in their good graces. But as I sat there looking up at the man who had supposedly sworn to protect me, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating sense of clarity. The fear that had controlled me for 33 years was completely gone. The desperate need for their approval evaporated into the cold air of the ballroom. I did not reach for the briefcase. I did not ask for the pen. Instead, I folded my hands neatly on my lap, looked my father dead in the eye, and delivered the truth they had spent decades trying to avoid. "You have never been a father, Richard," I said quietly. The softness of my voice forced everyone, including the security guards, to lean in slightly to hear me. "You are a real estate appraiser. And you have spent my entire life appraising your children like we are properties in a volatile market." Richard stiffened, his jaw clenching so hard I thought his teeth might crack. Brenda gasped quietly, deeply offended by my blatant disrespect, but I did not stop. I was finally speaking the script I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times during my lonely childhood. "You looked at Penelope when she was born and saw a high-yield asset." I continued, keeping my gaze locked firmly on him. "You saw someone you could mold, someone you could dress up in expensive clothes and parade around the country club to boost your own social equity. You invested heavily in her because she gave you the immediate return on investment you desperately craved. She gave you the bragging rights. She was the pristine mansion on the hill." I slowly turned my eyes to Penelope, who was staring at me with a mixture of shock and lingering fury. And when she married Jackson, you thought you were merging with a massive conglomerate. You thought you hit the absolute jackpot. You never once cared if he was actually a good man, or if he was honest, or if he treated her with genuine respect. You only cared about the valuations he whispered in your ear. You sold your own daughter to a con artist because the price tag looked appealing. "Shut your mouth," Brenda hissed, taking a threatening step forward. But one of the security guards surprisingly put his hand out to stop her, clearly unsure of how to handle the rapidly deteriorating family dynamic. "And then there is me," I said, returning my attention to Richard. "You appraised me very early on and decided I was a massive liability. I was not loud enough. I was not glamorous enough. I did not want to play your fake social games. So you systematically devalued me. You put a price tag on your love, Dad. You made it incredibly clear that your affection was a transaction and my currency was always insufficient. Every time I failed to meet your ridiculous expectations, you docked my worth." I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table, feeling the intense heat of the spotlight I had finally claimed. "But the most pathetic part of all of this is that you are actually a terrible investor. You remortgaged your entire life, you risked the roof over your own head to back a man who is actively stealing from you. And now, to save yourself from the consequences of your own blinding greed, you are demanding that I hand over my tiny, insignificant apartment. You are willing to leave your own child homeless just to buy yourself a few more weeks of pretending you are wealthy." 50 seconds have passed, Richard growled, completely ignoring my psychological dissection. He was too deeply entrenched in his own pride to absorb a single word of truth. 10 seconds left, Kendall. "Sign the paper or you are gone." "I will never sign that paper," I stated with absolute unshakable conviction. "I do not want your money. I do not want your fake legacy. And I absolutely do not want to be a part of this toxic, rotting family anymore. Keep your inheritance. You are going to need every single penny of it when the federal prosecutors freeze your bank accounts for aiding and abetting Jackson's massive corporate fraud." That was the breaking point. The moment the final cord of our familial bond was violently severed. Richard's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. He looked at the head of the security detail and gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Get her out of here," Richard commanded, his voice echoing loudly across the silent room. "Drag her out the back service doors. I do not want to see her face ever again." The security guards moved with ruthless efficiency. 2 massive men stepped behind my chair. One of them grabbed my left arm, his large hand wrapping entirely around my bicep with a crushing grip. The other grabbed my right arm. They hauled me up from the chair so fast, my ruined plate crashed to the floor, shattering into dozens of sharp pieces. The physical contact was jarring, violent, and deeply humiliating. Guests at the nearby tables gasped, some covering their mouths in shock, as they watched a young woman being forcefully manhandled at a luxury black tie event. Jackson let out a short, triumphant laugh, adjusting his suit jacket as he watched me get restrained. Penelope crossed her arms, a smug, satisfied smile returning to her face as she watched her lifelong rival finally being physically discarded. Brenda turned her back to me, entirely refusing to even watch the messy consequences of her own parenting. I did not scream. I did not thrash against the heavy grip of the security guards. I let them hold my arms, my feet barely touching the marble floor as they prepared to drag me through the massive ballroom. I kept my head held high, looking back at my family with an expression of pure, icy pity. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully eliminated the final threat to their fragile, fraudulent empire. The guards took their first heavy step backward, pulling me away from the table. But before they could take a second step, a massive, deafening sound completely shattered the tension in the room. The grand 20-foot mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom did not just open. They burst open with such violent force that they slammed against the marble walls, the heavy brass handles cracking the pristine plaster. Every single head in the ballroom snapped toward the entrance. The security guards holding my arms froze instantly, their grips loosening slightly as they instinctively assessed the sudden dramatic breach in the perimeter. Richard spun around, his face pale with sudden alarm. Jackson practically jumped out of his expensive shoes. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was completely shattered as the true power of Silicon Valley finally arrived to collect its prize. The heavy, suffocating silence of the room was completely shattered as the true power of Silicon Valley finally arrived to collect its prize. Elias Thorne stepped over the threshold of the shattered mahogany doors, bringing the crisp, cool air of the California night in with him. At 50 years old, Elias did not just walk into a room, he commanded the very gravity within it. He was not dressed in a flashy tuxedo like the rest of the men in the ballroom, who were desperately trying to display their wealth through expensive silk and velvet. He wore a simple, unstructured charcoal blazer over a black cashmere turtleneck. It was a signature, understated look that screamed a level of astronomical wealth where dress codes and social expectations simply ceased to apply. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, framing a face carved from years of ruthless corporate warfare. His sharp, hawkish eyes scanned the massive, opulent space with the bored, unimpressed indifference of a man who could purchase the entire estate, demolish it, and rebuild it before breakfast without ever checking his bank balance. Flanking him were 4 members of his personal security detail, and the contrast between them and my father's rented guards was almost comical. My father's men were large, bulky bouncers hired to look intimidating in cheap suits. Elias brought ghosts. These were ex-military professionals in flawlessly tailored dark suits, men who moved with a terrifying silent and fluid precision. They did not flex or scowl. They simply stepped into the room and immediately established total tactical dominance. 2 of them fanned out to secure the shattered entrance, while the other 2 formed an impenetrable wedge in front of Elias. They completely ignored the gala security guards who were still tightly gripping my arms. In fact, the moment Elias's men locked eyes with them, my father's guards instinctively shrank back, their shoulders dropping as they immediately recognized apex predators. The sheer dominant energy Elias brought into the room was absolutely suffocating, instantly crushing the toxic family drama that had been unfolding at table 4. The collective gasp from the 200 guests was completely audible, a sudden intake of breath that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the ballroom. The violent argument, the shattered china on the floor, the sight of me being forcefully manhandled, it was all instantly erased from their collective memory. I watched the incredibly wealthy, deeply arrogant elite of Palo Alto transform into star-struck, desperate teenagers in the span of 3 seconds. A low, feverish whisper swept across the tables like a wildfire fueled by pure greed. Elias Thorne. It is Elias. What is the chief executive officer of Vanguard completely doing at a suburban anniversary party? Is he looking for a new acquisition? The reactions were pathetic to witness. Glasses of vintage champagne were hastily set down on tables, spilling onto the white linens. Men who ran massive billion-dollar hedge funds suddenly straightened their posture, nervously checking their silk ties and running trembling hands through their hair. Women discreetly adjusted their diamond necklaces and pushed their shoulders back desperately, hoping to catch even a fraction of his attention. A local senator who had been actively watching my father threaten to disown me just moments ago, practically shoved his own wife aside to get a clearer line of sight to the doors. In Silicon Valley, Elias Thorne was not just a billionaire, he was a literal kingmaker. A single nod of approval from him could send a dying company's stock soaring into the stratosphere. A single 5-minute conversation could secure a financial legacy for generations. He was the absolute pinnacle of the ecosystem my parents and Jackson so desperately worshipped. The mythical dragon sitting on a mountain of gold they all wanted to touch. The string quartet in the corner, having completely abandoned their instruments out of sheer shock, stood frozen on their small stage, staring with wide eyes. Even the waitstaff stopped moving, leaving trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres hovering in midair. And then I watched Jackson. The psychological transformation he underwent in those few seconds was both hilarious and deeply, genuinely pathetic. A second ago, he was a furious, cornered rat, violently demanding that I hand over my apartment to save his skin. He had been sweating, stuttering, and terrified of the impending federal indictments. But the moment his eyes locked onto Elias Thorne, the sheer paralyzing panic morphed into a manic, blinding surge of absolute delusion. His desperate brain, frantically searching for any possible lifeline, instantly fabricated a completely insane narrative. He actually believed that Elias Thorne, the most reclusive and ruthless tech titan in the entire world, had crashed a random suburban anniversary gala to offer him a last-minute miraculous bailout for his fraudulent, failing startup. Jackson genuinely thought he was finally getting his Hollywood ending. "He is here," Jackson whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of awe and manic relief. "He is actually here for Titan. The Series C pitch deck I sent to his firm last month. He read it. He is here to fund us." Jackson lunged forward. In his frantic, desperate rush to intercept the billionaire before anyone else in the room could reach him, he violently shoved his heavy shoulder directly into my chest, knocking me backward with incredible force. The sudden impact caught me completely off guard. The gala security guards holding my arms lost their grip as I stumbled backward, my hip crashing hard against the sharp wooden edge of the dining table. A sharp jolt of pain shot up my spine, and I had to grip the tablecloth to keep from collapsing entirely to the floor. Jackson did not even look back to see if I was hurt. He did not care that he had just assaulted his sister-in-law in front of 200 people. He had completely forgotten about the eviction. He had forgotten about my apartment, the unsigned documents on the floor, and the threats of disownment. I was instantly rendered entirely invisible, cast aside like a piece of garbage blocking his path to the throne. He aggressively smoothed down the wide lapels of his custom Italian suit, violently swiping a trembling hand across his sweating forehead to clear the moisture. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his facial features to rearrange themselves. The terrified fraud disappeared, replaced instantly by the fake, charismatic visionary he used to scam his investors. He plastered on a massive, confident smile, revealing his perfectly bleached teeth. Penelope was right behind him, matching his delusional pivot with terrifying speed. The vicious, hateful sneer she had worn while insulting my intelligence and mocking my college rejection vanished entirely. She immediately switched into her highly polished Harvard graduate persona. Her posture straightened rigidly as she quickly checked her reflection in the blade of a silver butter knife resting on the table, fixing a stray blonde hair. She positioned herself perfectly, a half step behind her husband, playing the role of the supportive, brilliant wife, ready to assist in the pitch of a lifetime. Richard and Brenda, ever the ultimate opportunists, instantly abandoned their aggressive mission to throw me out onto the street. My father completely ignored the fact that his youngest daughter had just been forcefully shoved into a table and was currently clutching her bruised side. Instead, Richard hastily buttoned his tuxedo jacket, puffed out his chest, and stepped forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Jackson. He wanted to make sure Elias Thorne knew exactly who the patriarch of this successful family was. Brenda practically shoved the head of the gala security out of her way, her eyes fixed hungrily on Elias, as if he were a piece of raw meat. Her diamond tennis bracelets clinked loudly as she smoothed the front of her expensive gown. This was their ultimate validation. In their twisted, heavily status-obsessed minds, the sudden arrival of Elias Thorne meant that Jackson was truly as important as he constantly claimed to be. Why else would the most powerful man in the state walk into their private party? They were fully preparing to grovel, to offer up their absolute loyalty to the kingmaker, completely blind to the reality of the situation. I stood up slowly, brushing the dust off my ruined black evening gown, wincing slightly at the sharp pain in my hip. It was a grounded, physical reminder of the violence this family was capable of inflicting when their money was threatened. The two massive security guards who had been ready to drag me out the service doors were now standing awkwardly to the side, shifting their weight, completely unsure of what their orders were now that the family had abruptly abandoned the confrontation. The dynamic had shifted so violently that the guards looked almost embarrassed to be standing near me. I did not try to stop Jackson as he took his first eager, practically skipping steps toward the center of the ballroom. I did not yell out, and I certainly did not try to correct his entirely insane delusion. I simply stood by the shattered remains of our dinner setting, leaning slightly against the table for support, and watched my brother-in-law, my sister, and my parents eagerly march toward their own absolute public destruction. Jackson practically shoved a waiter out of his way, his eyes locked onto Elias like a heat-seeking missile. He was practicing his opening line under his breath, his lips moving silently as he rehearsed the exact combination of buzzwords he thought would secure him a $50 million check. Synergy, scalability, disruptive market paradigms. He was a desperate man pulling the final card from a marked deck, unaware that the entire casino had already been shut down. Penelope matched his eager stride, her high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was already mentally spending the money she believed Elias was about to hand them, her eyes gleaming with a toxic mixture of triumph and insatiable greed. She shot a quick, incredibly smug glance back over her shoulder at me, a silent, vicious message that she had won yet again, that her husband was a genius, and I was nothing but a bruised, humiliated spectator in her magnificent life. I held her gaze, my face a completely blank mask of icy composure. I let her have her fleeting moment of victory. I let all of them bask in the warm, blinding light of their monumental delusion. They thought they were walking toward their ultimate financial salvation, marching proudly up to the king of Silicon Valley to claim their rightful place among the elite. They were completely, devastatingly unaware that the terrifying billionaire they were about to bow down to was not there to save Titan. He was there because I had summoned him. Jackson closed the distance between himself and Elias Thorne in a matter of mere seconds, his hand extended outward in a desperate gesture of forced familiarity. Mr. Thorne Jackson practically shouted over the soft murmurs of the absolutely stunned crowd. "What an absolute honor it is to have you here tonight. I am Jackson, Chief Executive Officer and founder of Titan. I sent my Series C pitch deck to your private acquisition team just last month." Elias did not take the extended hand. He did not even look at it. He simply stood there, his sharp eyes locked onto Jackson with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a particularly frantic insect. The 4 elite bodyguards flanking the billionaire shifted their weight slightly, a silent warning that Jackson had stepped far too close to the perimeter. But Jackson was completely blinded by his own frantic ambition. He awkwardly pulled his unshaken hand back, wiping the nervous sweat onto the side of his custom-tailored trousers, and immediately launched into the most embarrassing unhinged elevator pitch I had ever witnessed in my entire life. "We are currently revolutionizing the decentralized data paradigm." Jackson stammered the words tumbling out of his mouth at a chaotic speed. "Our proprietary algorithmic infrastructure is fully optimized to disrupt the entire cloud storage ecosystem. We are projecting a 300% year-over-year growth trajectory once our Series C round officially closes. And seeing you here tonight, sir, it just confirms what I have always known. Great minds recognize great potential. We are ready to integrate with Vanguard. We have the scalability, the synergy, and the absolute raw talent to make you billions." He was literally vibrating with nervous energy. The thick beads of sweat I had noticed earlier had multiplied, turning his entire forehead into a slick, shiny mess under the bright ballroom chandeliers. He sounded less like a visionary tech founder and more like a desperate street vendor trying to sell a broken watch before the police arrived. It was a masterclass in secondhand embarrassment. The wealthy guests at the surrounding tables, people who had built actual legitimate fortunes, were exchanging deeply uncomfortable glances. They could smell the sheer desperation radiating off Jackson from 10 feet away, but Elias remained entirely statuesque. He did not blink. He did not offer a polite smile or a nod of professional acknowledgement. He just let Jackson keep talking, letting the silence between them grow so heavy and uncomfortable that it threatened to crack the marble floors. Jackson, completely misinterpreting the billionaire's silence as rapt attention, puffed out his chest and took another reckless step forward, eager to seal the imaginary deal he had completely fabricated in his own mind. Jackson stepped even closer, completely ignoring the subtle, dangerous shift of the ex-military bodyguards. His desperation was a physical entity in the room, heavy and suffocating. "You see, Mr. Thorne, Titan is not just software. It is a complete lifestyle integration. We are capturing user data metrics at a rate that completely outpaces our competitors. We have the vision. We just need the strategic capital to deploy our final phase. Jackson was literally begging now, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of his own lies. He was a man drowning in a stormy ocean, and he believed Elias was the luxury yacht coming to pull him out of the freezing water. That was when Penelope decided to deploy her own tactical charm. She smoothly glided up to her husband's side, gently placing a manicured hand on his arm to physically ground him. She offered Elias a brilliant, perfectly practiced smile, the kind of smile she usually reserved for country club board members and elite fashion photographers. "Mr. Thorne," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I am Penelope Jackson's wife and the Chief Marketing Officer for Titan. It is truly a privilege to welcome you to our family's celebration. We were actually just discussing Vanguard at the Harvard Alumni Networking event last weekend. Several of my former professors consider your recent market acquisitions to be absolutely brilliant." She paused, clearly expecting the mention of her Ivy League education to act as a magical key that would instantly unlock the billionaire's respect. It was her ultimate social currency, the single accomplishment she used to elevate herself above everyone else in the room. She tilted her head, maintaining intense eye contact with Elias, waiting for him to welcome her into the exclusive club of the intellectual elite. But Elias simply shifted his gaze from Jackson's sweating face to Penelope's painfully eager smile. He looked at her the same way one might look at a slightly annoying stain on a clean window. There was no recognition, no professional respect, and absolutely no warmth. And Penelope, eager to reinforce this desperate narrative, took another step forward as well. "Our internal corporate culture is completely aligned with Vanguard core values." She lied effortlessly, her Harvard-trained debate skills kicking into overdrive. "We prioritize aggressive innovation and absolute market dominance. My husband has worked tirelessly, sacrificing everything to build this infrastructure, and my parents have graciously provided the foundational backing. We are a unified front, Mr. Thorne. A family of winners, ready to partner with the absolute best in the global industry." The sheer awkwardness of the one-sided interaction was physically painful to watch. Jackson and Penelope were standing in front of the most powerful man in the state, frantically performing a desperate song and dance routine, completely unaware that the music had never even started. They were throwing every single buzzword, every credential, and every ounce of their manufactured charm at a brick wall. But my parents, ever the opportunists, completely failed to read the freezing temperature of the room. Seeing their golden couple supposedly engaging in high-level networking with a billionaire, Richard and Brenda aggressively shoved their way to the front of the line to claim their share of the non-existent glory. Richard aggressively buttoned his tuxedo jacket and puffed out his chest, stepping squarely into Elias Thorne's personal space. "Sir, I am Richard, the patriarch of this family," he boomed, using his deep real estate voice to project an aura of established wealth. "I just want to personally thank you for taking the time to come down here tonight. I am the primary angel investor behind Titan. I have personally vetted Jackson's entire business model, and I can assure you putting your capital into his hands will be the most lucrative decision Vanguard makes this entire decade. We have leveraged substantial personal assets to ensure this company reaches its maximum potential. We are a family that understands the absolute value of high-risk, high-reward ventures." Richard nodded vigorously, adjusting his posture to appear more authoritative. "Absolutely correct. And as the primary financial backer, I can guarantee that our books are completely pristine. We run a tight ship, no dead weight." Which brings us back to the unfortunate situation with my youngest daughter. Richard gestured vaguely toward me again, his face twisting into a mask of pure disdain. "You have to understand the burden of carrying someone who simply refuses to elevate themselves. We tried to give her the world, but she chose to wallow in mediocrity. It is a tragic flaw in her character." Brenda quickly flanked her husband, her diamond bracelets clanking loudly as she practically bowed to the man standing before them. She flashed a wide, entirely genuine smile, her eyes glittering with unadulterated greed. "Oh, Mr. Thorne, we are simply thrilled beyond words," Brenda gushed, her voice pitching up an entire octave. When Penelope married Jackson, we knew he was destined for absolute greatness. He is a true visionary just like you. We have always fostered an environment of excellence in our home. We push our children to achieve the absolute highest echelons of success, which is why Penelope attended Harvard, and why they are building this incredible empire together. We are a family built on prestige, intelligence, and flawless execution. She was trying so incredibly hard to paint the picture of a perfect elite dynasty. But then Brenda made a fatal miscalculation. She suddenly remembered that I was still standing just a few feet away, firmly gripped by the two rented security guards. In her desperate, frantic attempt to present a completely flawless image to the billionaire, she realized that the sight of a young woman in a ruined evening gown being physically restrained by security was a massive, embarrassing blemish on her perfect family portrait. She needed to quickly explain away my humiliating presence before Elias could form a negative opinion of her parenting. "Please excuse the minor disturbance over there by the tables," Brenda said, leaning closer to Elias and lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper, completely oblivious to the fact that his elite bodyguards were glaring directly at her. She waved a dismissive, heavily jeweled hand in my general direction. "That is just our youngest daughter, Kendall. She is well, she has always been the troubled one of the family. We try our absolute best to include her in these high society events out of pure charity, but she simply does not know how to conduct herself in polite company." Richard immediately chimed in, eager to entirely separate their pristine brand from my supposed failure. "Yes, she is a college dropout, I am afraid." Richard sighed heavily, shaking his head with an expression of deeply manufactured sorrow. "She has no ambition, no education, and a terrible temper. She was just throwing a deeply embarrassing jealous tantrum because she cannot handle seeing her sister and brother-in-law achieve such monumental success. We actually had to call security to escort her off the premises because she was harassing Jackson and trying to ruin his big night. You know how these bitter, unsuccessful people are, Mr. Thorne. They just want to drag brilliant minds down to their miserable level." Penelope let out a soft, completely fake sigh of sisterly despair. "It is truly exhausting," she added, looking at Elias with wide, innocent eyes. "We give her everything, and she just repays us with completely psychotic behavior. She was actually just shouting completely baseless lies about Jackson being investigated by federal authorities. Can you imagine? It is purely pathetic. She fixes computers for a living, and suddenly thinks she is a corporate whistleblower. We are so incredibly sorry you had to witness such a trashy display. Please do not let her unfortunate presence reflect poorly on Titan or our family." Brenda placed a comforting hand on Jackson's shoulder, presenting him as the true victim of my supposed cruelty. "Jackson has been so incredibly patient with her," Brenda cooed softly. "He even offered to help her financially to give her a small role in his massive success, and she completely threw it back in his face with those ridiculous accusations. We are just so relieved that you arrived when you did, Mr. Thorne. It completely changes the energy in the room. We can finally focus on the future, on building this incredible partnership with Vanguard, and we can leave the failures of the past behind us where they completely belong." They had completely and totally thrown me under the bus. In the span of 3 minutes, my own parents and my sister had meticulously painted me as an unhinged, jealous, uneducated loser just to make themselves look marginally better in front of a man they wanted to exploit for cash. They stood there practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, confident that they had successfully neutralized the threat I posed, while simultaneously securing the ultimate financial bailout. Jackson grinned widely, his confidence fully restored by the unwavering support of his toxic enablers. He looked at Elias, waiting for the billionaire to nod in sympathetic agreement, waiting for the kingmaker to dismiss the crazy sister and write the massive check that would save his fraudulent life. I stood perfectly still in the grip of the security guards, my hip throbbing with dull pain from where Jackson had violently shoved me. I listened to every single hateful, degrading word they spoke about me. I listened to my mother call me a charity case. I listened to my father call me a bitter failure. I listened to my sister call me a psychotic loser. And I did absolutely nothing to defend myself. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for my dignity. I just watched the silent, terrifying face of Elias Thorne, waiting for the exact moment he would pull the rug out from under their completely delusional universe. Jackson wiped his forehead one last time, extending his hand once again toward the silent billionaire. "So Mr. Thorne," Jackson said, his voice dropping into a hushed, desperate whisper, "shall we step into the private study and discuss the preliminary terms of the acquisition? I promise you this will be the greatest investment you have ever made in your entire life." The stage was perfectly set. The villains had proudly presented their absolute worst selves, completely destroying their own credibility, while actively trying to destroy mine. They had fully committed to their lies, completely unaware that the man they were so desperately trying to impress already knew the entire devastating truth. They had fully committed to their lies, completely unaware that the man they were so desperately trying to impress already knew the entire devastating truth. Jackson stood frozen with his hand extended toward the billionaire. The physical distance between his trembling fingers and Elias Thorne's immaculate charcoal blazer was only about 2 feet, but in the brutal currency of Silicon Valley power dynamics, it might as well have been an insurmountable canyon. The seconds began to tick by. 1, 2, 3. In normal conversation, a 3-second pause is slightly uncomfortable. In a high-stakes acquisition pitch, playing out in front of 200 of your wealthiest peers, a 3-second pause is a public execution. The silence in the ballroom became so profound, so incredibly absolute, that I could clearly hear the faint hum of the industrial air conditioning units working to cool the massive space. Elias did not look at Jackson's outstretched hand. He did not lower his gaze to acknowledge the desperate offering. Instead, his sharp, hawkish eyes remained locked directly onto Jackson's sweating, panicking face. The billionaire's expression was not angry. It was not disgusted. It was something far more terrifying to a narcissist like my brother-in-law. It was an expression of total, absolute boredom. Elias looked at Jackson the exact same way a person looks at a piece of junk mail before tossing it into the shredder. There was zero recognition of Jackson's supposed genius, zero respect for his title as a chief executive officer, and absolutely zero interest in the fraudulent empire he was trying to sell. I watched the devastating realization hit Jackson in real time. The manic, blinding confidence that had propelled him across the ballroom floor began to rapidly drain from his body, leaking out through the heavy beads of sweat rolling down his temples. His perfectly bleached smile faltered the corners of his mouth, twitching uncontrollably as his brain desperately tried to process the massive rejection. He had thrown his absolute best pitch, utilizing every single industry buzzword he had stolen from actual innovators, and it had slammed into a brick wall of pure, icy indifference. His outstretched arm began to visibly shake. The muscles in his shoulders spasmed, but he was too terrified to pull the hand back. To retract the handshake now would be an admission of total defeat. So he stood there suspended in a horrific purgatory of his own making, begging for a scrap of validation that was never going to come. Penelope, standing just a half step behind her husband, felt the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. Her Harvard-trained social instincts, usually so incredibly sharp, were completely short-circuiting. She was accustomed to men of wealth and power melting under her carefully practiced charm. She was used to leveraging her beauty and her Ivy League pedigree to secure whatever she wanted. But as she stared at the side of Elias Thorne's face, waiting for him to turn his attention to her, her confident posture began to physically crumble. Her bright artificial smile became frozen, painfully stretched across her face like a plastic mask. She opened her mouth perhaps to offer another desperate compliment, or to mention another prestigious alumni event. But the sheer crushing weight of Elias's silence choked the words right out of her throat. For the very first time in her 35 years of life, the golden child realized she was completely and utterly invisible. Behind them, my parents were undergoing a similar psychological collapse. Richard, who had aggressively puffed out his chest to declare himself the patriarch of a massive financial dynasty, suddenly looked like a deflated balloon. The deep, authoritative real estate voice he had used to command the room just moments ago now felt like a completely ridiculous joke. He looked around the ballroom, making frantic, panicked eye contact with his wealthy friends and country club associates. He saw the way they were looking at his family. The awe and jealousy from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by pity and secondhand embarrassment. Richard was watching his carefully curated social reputation disintegrate into dust right in front of his eyes. Brenda blinked rapidly, her heavy diamond earrings swinging as she looked frantically from Elias to Jackson and then to Penelope. Her brain simply could not compute the data it was receiving. In her heavily status-obsessed reality, billionaire investors were supposed to eagerly shake hands with brilliant tech founders. They were supposed to congratulate proud parents on raising such exceptional children. They were not supposed to stand there like statues radiating an aura of freezing disdain. Brenda instinctively reached out her fingers weakly, grasping the fabric of Richard's tuxedo jacket, seeking physical support as the floor dropped out from under their delusions of grandeur. Then Elias Thorne finally moved. He did not offer a polite excuse. He did not say a single word. He simply took a step forward. He did not alter his trajectory to gracefully walk around Jackson. He moved in a straight, perfectly calculated line, forcing Jackson to physically scramble out of his way to avoid a collision. Jackson stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the marble floor. He bumped hard into Penelope, who let out a sharp gasp as she was shoved aside by her own husband. The perfectly united front they had presented just moments ago was instantly shattered, reduced to a pair of terrified frauds stumbling over each other to get out of the billionaire's path. The four elite bodyguards moved in flawless synchronization with their boss. They did not push my family, but their physical presence was so incredibly dominant that Richard and Brenda practically jumped backward to clear the way. My father backed up so quickly that his hip slammed into a nearby dining table, causing a tray of champagne glasses to rattle dangerously. My mother pressed her hands against her chest, her face pale with shock, as the imposing men in dark suits swept past her without a single glance. The walk from the center of the ballroom to where I was standing felt agonizingly slow. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a perfectly executed maneuver designed to strip my family of every last ounce of their dignity. Elias walked past Jackson, leaving the fraudulent founder completely abandoned in the middle of the room. He walked past Penelope, completely ignoring her expensive crimson gown and her desperate, lingering smile. He walked past my parents, disregarding their frantic attempts to align themselves with his wealth. With every single step Elias took, the collective understanding of the room shifted. The wealthy guests, watching the incredibly tense scene unfold, finally realized that the kingmaker of Silicon Valley had absolutely zero interest in Titan. He had not come to Palo Alto to save Jackson's sinking ship. He had walked right through the so-called royalty of the evening as if they were completely transparent. Elias bypassed the ruined dining table where my plate still sat shattered on the floor. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The two rented gala security guards, who were still tightly gripping my arms, suddenly realized the incredibly dangerous position they were currently in. They were holding a woman captive, and the most powerful billionaire in the state had just walked straight up to her, bypassing everyone else in the room to do so. The massive, intimidating bouncers my father had hired suddenly looked like terrified children. They looked at Elias, then looked up at the 4 elite ex-military bodyguards, who had fanned out behind the billionaire, forming a highly trained protective wall around us. The air crackled with raw physical tension. The lead bodyguard, a man with cold, calculating eyes and a slight scar across his jawline, took a single deliberate step toward the rented guards. He did not raise his hands. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stared at the hands gripping my arms with an expression that promised absolute immediate violence if they did not let go. The rented guards began to sweat profusely. They looked desperately toward my father, their actual employer, silently begging for instructions. But Richard was standing frozen 10 feet away, completely immobilized by shock and fear. He had no power here. His threats, his money, his influence, They were all completely neutralized by the overwhelming force standing in front of me. Elias Thorne did not wait for the rented guards to figure out their next move. He raised his right hand, his expression still completely unreadable, and snapped his fingers. It was a sharp, piercing sound that echoed like a gunshot in the dead-silent ballroom. The command was instantaneous. The elite bodyguards did not hesitate. Two of them stepped sharply forward, invading the personal space of the gala security. They did not strike them, but the threat was so incredibly clear, so completely undeniable, that the rented guards reacted entirely on pure survival instinct. They released my arms as if my skin had suddenly caught fire. They immediately raised their hands in the air, a universal gesture of total surrender, and rapidly backed away, stumbling over the shattered pieces of porcelain on the floor, to put as much distance between themselves and Elias Thorne's detail as physically possible. I stood there, finally free from their crushing grip. I slowly rolled my shoulders, rubbing the bruised skin on my biceps where the guards had dug their fingers in. The dull ache in my hip from where Jackson had violently shoved me still throbbed, but I barely felt it. The adrenaline rushing through my veins was absolute and intoxicating. The entire ballroom was holding its collective breath. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 200 pairs of eyes were locked directly onto me, and the billionaire standing quietly in front of me. I could see Jackson out of the corner of my eye. He was staring at us, his mouth hanging slightly open, his brain completely unable to comprehend why the man he thought was his savior was currently standing in front of his deeply hated sister-in-law. Penelope was clutching her chest, her knuckles turning white. Richard and Brenda looked as though they were about to collapse from the sheer terrifying confusion of the moment. They were all waiting for Elias to speak. They were waiting for him to order me out of the room, or to ask me for directions, or to do absolutely anything that fit within their incredibly narrow, toxic worldview, where I was nothing but a worthless failure. Elias Thorne adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal blazer. He looked at my ruined black evening gown, noting the spilled lemon sauce and the slight rumple of the fabric from the physical altercation. His sharp eyes softened just a fraction, a microscopic shift that only I could see. And then, in front of my arrogant brother-in-law, in front of my cruel Ivy League-educated sister, in front of the parents who had just threatened to throw me onto the street, and in front of every single wealthy, judgmental guest, in that opulent Palo Alto ballroom, Elias Thorne performed an action that completely destroyed their universe. He placed his hands clasped perfectly in front of him, planted his feet together, and bowed his head. It was not a quick, polite nod. It was a deep, deliberate, and incredibly respectful bow from a man who bowed to absolutely no one. The gesture carried the weight of absolute subservience, a public declaration of loyalty and profound respect. Elias slowly straightened his posture, looking me directly in the eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm, deeply resonant, and carried perfectly across the dead silent room. My apologies for the delay, boss. The NDA took longer than expected. My apologies for the delay, boss. The NDA took longer than expected. The words left Elias Thorne's mouth and hung in the air like a physical blow. The absolute absurdity of the statement, the sheer impossibility of the most powerful billionaire in California referring to the family failure as boss short-circuited every single brain in the ballroom. Jackson actually stumbled backward another step, his polished shoe catching on the edge of the carpet, his hands flying out to steady himself against a chair. Penelope let out a strange, choked gasp, a sound caught halfway between a laugh and a sob, as if her mind simply refused to process the reality unfolding before her eyes. Elias did not wait for them to recover. He straightened his posture, turning his sharp, commanding gaze away from me and slowly scanning the crowd of wealthy, deeply confused guests. He locked eyes briefly with Richard, who was standing frozen like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming freight train, before addressing the entire room. His voice was not loud, but it carried absolute, undeniable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias began the silence in the room so profound you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but when a merger of this magnitude is finalized, protocol demands a certain level of immediate action. Vanguard is proud to announce the official acquisition of Aegis Technologies. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, particularly among the venture capitalists and tech executives seated near the front. The name Aegis was not a secret in their circles. It was the white whale of Silicon Valley. For the past 2 years, Aegis had been the most heavily guarded, aggressively sought after anonymous artificial intelligence encryption software on the global market. It was a phantom program, a masterclass in data security that had consistently humiliated the cyber defenses of major corporations and even government agencies during stress tests. Everyone knew about Aegis. Everyone wanted to buy Aegis. But absolutely nobody knew who had actually created it. The founder was a ghost operating entirely in the shadows, rejecting massive acquisition offers through an anonymous legal proxy. Elias raised his right hand, silencing the murmurs instantly. The founder of Aegis has been incredibly elusive. He continued, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. She demanded absolute anonymity until the terms of the buyout were finalized. She did not care about the fame the magazine covers or the social prestige. She only cared about the code. And I must admit, negotiating with her has been the single most grueling, terrifying, and brilliant experience of my entire professional career. He turned back to face me, his expression softening into genuine, profound respect. He extended his hand toward me, not for a handshake, but in a sweeping gesture of introduction. I am incredibly honored to finally introduce the sole founder, the lead developer, and the absolute mastermind behind Aegis, Miss Kendall. If Elias had announced that the moon was made of green cheese, it would have been met with less shock. The physical reaction from my family was catastrophic. Brenda, my mother, who had spent the last 33 years treating me like a defective burden, literally dropped her expensive designer clutch. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, the clasp breaking and spilling lipstick and credit cards everywhere. She did not even look down. She just stared at me, her jaw hanging slack, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of horror and realization. Richard reached out blindly, grabbing the back of a dining chair with a grip so tight his knuckles turned completely white. The patriarch of the family, the man who had just threatened to throw me onto the street because I refused to fund Jackson's fraudulent startup, suddenly looked 20 years older. His legs seemed to give out slightly, and he practically collapsed into the chair, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. He looked from Elias to me and back to Elias, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. But the most devastating reaction came from Jackson. The charismatic tech bro, the supposed visionary, who had just spent the last hour aggressively mocking my intelligence, looked as though he was having a genuine medical emergency. His face, already slick with nervous sweat, turned an unnatural ashen gray. He began to hyperventilate, short, sharp gasps of air tearing through his throat. He looked at me, then at Elias, his mind desperately trying to find a loophole, a lie, a misunderstanding. It had to be a mistake. Kendall, the girl who fixed computers in a basement, could not possibly be the genius behind Aegis. It went against every single narrative he had built his entire identity around. No, Jackson choked out the word barely audible. No, that is impossible. She is just a... She drops out. She does not know how to code an AI framework. Elias ignored him completely. He reached inside his charcoal blazer and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope stamped with the heavy, undeniable seal of the Federal Reserve. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, heightening the agonizing tension in the room. He handed the envelope to the lead bodyguard standing beside him. The bodyguard opened the seal, removed a crisp, heavily watermarked document, and held it out for Elias. Elias took the document, holding it up so the intricate security threads caught the light of the chandeliers. The acquisition of Aegis was finalized exactly 47 minutes ago. Elias announced, his voice ringing with finality. The terms were non-negotiable. Vanguard has purchased the intellectual property, the source code, and the exclusive rights to the Aegis algorithm. He turned to me, a small, triumphant smile breaking through his normally stoic facade. He lowered the document, revealing it to be a massive ceremonial cashier's check. It was not a prop. It was a certified financial instrument, drafted by one of the largest banks in the world, made out directly to my legal name. The purchase price, Elias stated clearly, making sure every single person in the room heard the number is $50 million. He held the check out to me. I looked at the piece of paper. It felt surprisingly light for something that carried the weight of absolute freedom. I did not snatch it. I did not cry or scream with joy. I reached out calmly, taking the check from Elias's hands, and held it casually at my side, as if he had just handed me a glass of water. The silence broke. It did not break with applause or cheers, but with a chaotic, suffocating wave of shock. Guests were openly pointing, whispering frantically behind their hands. The senator, who had been eager to meet Elias, was now staring at me with a look of terrifying calculation, already trying to figure out how to align himself with my newly discovered wealth. Penelope finally snapped. The golden child, the Harvard graduate who had built her entire existence on being superior to me, could not handle the destruction of her reality. She lunged forward, her crimson gown swishing aggressively around her ankles. She stopped a few feet away from me, her face contorted into an ugly, desperate mask of denial. "This is a joke!" Penelope shrieked, her voice cracking violently. "This is some kind of sick, twisted prank you are pulling to ruin Jackson's night. You paid someone to pretend to be Elias Thorne. You forged that check. You are a liar, Kendall. You are a pathetic, jealous liar." Elias did not even turn his head to look at her. The lead bodyguard, however, shifted his stance slightly, placing his hand casually near his lapel. Penelope saw the subtle movement and instantly froze, terrified of the lethal professionals standing between us. "It is not a joke, Penelope," I said, my voice completely steady, a stark contrast to her hysterical screaming. "I told you. I do not care about your champagne celebrations. While you were busy memorizing marketing buzzwords to impress country club members, I was building an infrastructure that major corporations actually need. I did not drop out of state college because it was too difficult. I dropped out because I was already contracting security protocols for the Department of Defense. I just did not want you or mom or dad to try and claim credit for my work." Jackson let out a sound that was half sob, half furious growl. He pushed past Penelope, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. "You cannot have $50 million, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the check in my hand. "Titan is the future. I am the visionary. I pitched you, Mr. Thorne. I showed you the scalability. She is nothing. She is a glorified IT girl. You are making a massive mistake." He was completely unraveling. The polished, charismatic facade had burned away entirely, leaving only a desperate, terrified fraud screaming into the void. He was watching his last hope of salvation evaporate, realizing that the billionaire he worshipped had bypassed him entirely to crown the sister-in-law he so deeply despised. "You need to look at Titan," Jackson begged, actually taking a step toward Elias, ignoring the immediate threatening posture of the bodyguards. "Please, Mr. Thorne. We are weeks away from an IPO. We just need a minor bridge loan. I can make you billions." Elias finally looked at Jackson. The look of boredom had vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical precision. "I do not invest in vaporware." "Jackson," Elias said, his voice slicing through the frantic begging like a scalpel. "I do not invest in stolen code, fabricated user metrics, or chief executive officers who use their company's seed money to purchase luxury sports cars, while their servers crash from basic traffic overload." Jackson's face went from gray to a sickly, terrifying pale white. The room gasped again. Elias Thorne, the kingmaker, was publicly executing Jackson's reputation with ruthless efficiency. "And I certainly do not invest in men who attempt to steal their own sister-in-law's apartment to cover up massive federal tax fraud," Elias added softly, delivering the final devastating blow. "The SEC raid on your office was not a routine compliance check. They found the offshore accounts. It is over." Jackson staggered backward, hitting the ruined dining table. He collapsed onto it, sending the remaining silverware clattering to the floor. He buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. The golden boy, the tech visionary, was completely destroyed. I stood holding the $50 million check, watching the total collapse of the toxic dynasty that had tormented me for 3 decades. But I was not finished. The check was only the first part of the absolute destruction. The real punishment, the terrifying logic of corporate warfare, was still waiting in Elias's pocket. I stood holding the $50 million check, watching the total collapse of the toxic dynasty that had tormented me for 3 decades. But I was not finished. The check was only the first part of the absolute destruction. The real punishment, the terrifying logic of corporate warfare, was still waiting in Elias's pocket. Jackson violently pushed himself off the shattered dining table, his face entirely slick with sweat and tears. His sorrow had instantly mutated into a frantic, unhinged rage. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at me, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to reclaim control of a narrative that had already burned to ash. "She hacked you," Jackson screamed, his voice echoing shrilly across the cavernous ballroom. "Mr. Thorne, listen to me. She is a fraud. She must have infiltrated your internal communications and fabricated this entire acquisition. There is absolutely no way she wrote Aegis. She does not even have a degree. She is a pathetic loser who fixes broken laptops." Elias did not even blink at the outburst. He simply gestured toward me with an open palm, silently handing over the floor. The Kingmaker was officially stepping back to let me execute my own justice. I carefully folded the $50 million check and slid it into the small pocket of my evening gown. I took 2 deliberate steps forward, closing the distance between myself and the man who had spent the last 5 years making my life a living hell. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you hold absolute power, a whisper is far more deafening than a scream. "You want to talk about frauds, Jackson?" I asked, my voice carrying a cold metallic edge that made several guests in the front row physically shiver. "Let us talk about Titan. Let us talk about the revolutionary decentralized data paradigm you have been desperately trying to sell tonight." Jackson flinched, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he realized I was about to dissect his life's work in front of the very investors he had been begging for cash. "Your entire flagship software is a complete hallucination," I stated, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. "For the past 6 months, while you thought I was rotting in my basement, I was actually running diagnostic stress tests on Titan's back-end architecture. Your proprietary algorithm is nothing but an open-source template you purchased for $400 off a developer forum. You changed the user interface, slapped a sleek minimalist logo on the dashboard, and called it a disruptive market innovation." "No," Jackson gasped, shaking his head frantically. "That is a lie. That is a complete fabrication. My development team built that code from scratch." "Your development team consists of 3 underpaid interns, operating out of a co-working space," I countered effortlessly, cutting off his panicked defense. "And the code they are working with is held together by digital duct tape. Your data encryption protocols are entirely non-existent. During my preliminary scan, it took my automated systems exactly 14 seconds to bypass your firewall." 14 seconds, Jackson. A bored teenager with a basic understanding of Python scripting could have breached your servers and downloaded your entire user database while eating breakfast. You do not have a tech company. You have a shiny digital brochure that instantly collapses the moment anyone actually tries to use it. The venture capitalists and hedge fund managers in the crowd began whispering furiously to one another. Some were already pulling out their phones, rapidly typing messages to their financial teams to completely blacklist Titan from any future investment portfolios. Jackson was watching his reputation evaporate in real time. But the pathetic code is not even the worst part. I continued, stepping even closer, forcing Jackson to retreat until his back hit the edge of the table again. "The real tragedy is your financial ledger. You have been standing here tonight bragging about your Series B funding rounds and your impending initial public offering. You convinced my parents to remortgage their family estate to fund your visionary expansion." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with my sister. Penelope was standing completely frozen, her hands clutching the fabric of her expensive crimson gown. Her arrogant, condescending smirk had entirely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, dawning horror. "Did he tell you where that seed money actually went, Penelope?" I asked, my voice echoing clearly through the silent room. "Did your brilliant, successful husband ever show you the actual expense reports?" Penelope swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward Jackson, who was now shaking his head in a pathetic, silent plea for her to look away. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned back to Jackson, delivering the executioner's blow. Aegis does not just encrypt data, it tracks financial anomalies across decentralized networks. When I ran the trace on Titan's corporate accounts, I did not find investments in server infrastructure or research and development. I found a massive, intricate web of offshore shell companies. I found the exact routing numbers you used to siphon millions of dollars from your angel investors directly into your personal checking accounts. Jackson let out a loud, pathetic whimper, his knees visibly buckling under the weight of the truth. You did not use that money to build a global empire, Jackson. You used it to buy the illusion of one. I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure every single person in the ballroom heard the exact details of his crimes. You embezzled $2.4 million to purchase the matching luxury sports cars parked in my parents' driveway. You funneled $400,000 through a fake consulting firm to buy Penelope's diamond tennis bracelets and her custom engagement ring. You spent investor capital on private jet rentals, luxury vacations to the Maldives, and custom Italian suits just so you could walk into rooms like this and pretend you belonged here. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. This was no longer just a story about a failing tech startup. This was a massive, highly illegal corporate embezzlement scheme unfolding live in front of the Palo Alto elite. You are not a tech visionary, I stated with absolute crushing finality. You are not a genius. You are just a common, desperate thief in an expensive suit. You stole money from innocent people to fund a lifestyle you could never actually afford. And when the walls finally started closing in, when the federal investigators seized your servers and froze your accounts, you decided to steal my home to buy yourself a few more weeks of freedom. The absolute devastation on Penelope's face was a masterpiece of karmic justice. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life believing she was vastly superior to me because of the wealthy man she married, was suddenly realizing her entire existence was funded by federal felonies. She looked down at the heavy diamond ring sparkling on her finger, then looked up at Jackson with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Is it true?" Penelope demanded, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek. "Jackson, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not buy my ring with stolen money." Jackson could not even look at her. He stared down at his expensive polished shoes, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. He had absolutely nothing left to say. His buzzwords, his aggressive posturing, his manipulative gaslighting, they were all completely useless against the brutal, undeniable weight of the truth. He was a completely broken man, stripped of his fake armor and exposed to the world as a fraud. My parents, Richard and Brenda, were in a state of catatonic shock. Richard was slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, realizing that the man he had trusted with his entire retirement fund was going to federal prison. Brenda was staring blankly at the floor, her mind completely shattered by the destruction of her perfect family image. The social prestige she cared so deeply about was gone forever. They would be the laughingstock of their country club, the foolish parents who mortgaged their mansion to fund a criminal enterprise. I looked at the four of them, the toxic dynasty that had actively tried to crush my spirit for over 30 decades. They were drowning in the exact misery they had tried to inflict upon me. Jackson slowly raised his head, his face contorted in a pathetic, desperate mask of surrender. He looked at Elias, then looked at me, his hands trembling as he clasped them together in a begging motion. "Kendall, please," he choked out, his voice thick with tears. "Please. If you expose the financial ledgers, the SEC will issue an arrest warrant tomorrow morning. I will go to federal prison. I will lose everything. You have $50 million now. You are rich. You won. Just let me walk away. Just let Titan quietly declare bankruptcy. I will disappear. I swear to you, I will never bother you again." He was actually begging me for mercy. The man who less than an hour ago had aggressively demanded I sign over my home and mocked me for being a worthless failure was now crying on his knees, begging the computer repair girl to save his life. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no sympathy, and no hesitation. He had built his entire life by stepping on the throats of other people, and I was not going to be the one to pull him out of the grave he had dug for himself. "I do not negotiate with thieves, Jackson. I said softly. But that was not the end of the punishment. I had methodically destroyed his reputation and exposed his crimes, but there was still one massive, devastating piece of leverage left to deploy. The final twist of the knife that would ensure my family never recovered from this night. I turned my attention back to Elias Thorne. The billionaire had been watching the entire exchange with a look of quiet, satisfied approval. He had clearly enjoyed watching the arrogant tech bro get dismantled piece by piece. Elias, I said, my voice completely steady. Do you have the second folder? Elias nodded, reaching into the inner pocket of his charcoal blazer once again. He pulled out a sleek black leather folder. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he held it out directly toward my father. Richard slowly lifted his head from his hands, his eyes red and bloodshot. He looked at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. What is that? Richard croaked, his authoritative real estate voice completely gone, replaced by the terrified whisper of a broken man. I walked over to my father, stopping just inches away from his chair. I looked down at him, remembering the sheer cruelty in his eyes when he ordered his security guards to throw me onto the street. That, Dad, is the final consequence of your incredibly poor investment strategy, I said. I prepared to drop the ultimate logical checkmate, the legal maneuver that would not just embarrass them, but completely strip them of everything they owned. Richard stared at the black leather folder as if it were a coiled viper, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He remained collapsed in the dining chair, the picture of a man whose entire world had just been systematically dismantled. Brenda had stopped crying, her face frozen in a mask of shell-shocked disbelief, while Penelope stood nearby staring at Jackson with an expression of such profound cold hatred that it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Jackson, meanwhile, was still huddled on the floor against the side of the table, his sobbing having faded into a low, animalistic whimpering. I did not wait for my father to recover his senses. I stepped forward and took the folder from Elias's hand, the weight of the document feeling surprisingly heavy in my grip. I stood over my father, the man who had spent 33 years measuring my worth in pennies and dismissing my intellect as a liability. I watched as he looked up at me, his eyes filled with a new, terrifying emotion. It wasn't the arrogant disdain he had used to rule over our childhood, and it wasn't the cold, calculated indifference he displayed when he threw me out of the family. It was pure, unadulterated fear. He finally understood that the balance of power had shifted permanently. He was no longer the patriarch of the family. He was a man holding a losing hand against a grandmaster. "Kendall, please!" Richard croaked, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic tremor. "You have the money now. $50 million is enough to secure your entire future. You can walk away. You can go back to New York, or buy a house in Europe, or do whatever you want. But please look at what you are doing to your mother and your sister. Look at this family. We can fix this. If you just take that $50 million and pay off the debts, everything goes back to normal. We can clear Jackson's name, we can save the estate, and we can start over as a real family." I couldn't help it. A short, sharp laugh escaped my throat, devoid of any humor. It was a cold sound, a reflection of the reality they had forced me to accept over the course of my life. Normal, I asked, the word tasting like ash. You want to go back to a normal where I am the scapegoat, where I am the failure, and where I exist only to fund your vanity? You really have no idea how this works, do you, Dad? I tossed the folder onto the dining table, the sound of it hitting the surface echoing through the ballroom. It landed directly in front of my father, the leather cover sliding across the white linen, until it knocked over a half-empty glass of wine, which spilled red liquid across the table, like a fresh, pulsing wound. "You still think in terms of family obligations and emotional manipulation?" I continued, my voice echoing clearly for the room to hear. "You still think you can guilt me into saving you, but you forgot one very important lesson. When you spend 3 decades devaluing a person, when you systematically strip away their security and their agency, you eventually force them to stop playing by your rules. You forced me to learn the game of survival. And I didn't just learn it, Dad. I mastered it." Elias Thorne stepped forward, his face a mask of cold corporate professionalism. The acquisition of Aegis was never just about the software he announced, his voice vibrating with the power of his entire conglomerate behind it. Kendall made the sale contingent upon a very specific series of asset transfers. My father's eyes widened, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the leather folder. Asset transfers. I signaled for Elias to continue, leaning back and crossing my arms, feeling a surge of absolute, intoxicating victory. Explain it to him, Elias. Explain how the real world operates when you aren't just selling buzzwords in a suburban ballroom. Elias nodded, his expression revealing nothing. Vanguard didn't just buy Aegis Technologies. At Kendall's request, my team identified the specific private equity firm that was currently holding the high-interest mezzanine debt for Titan, and more importantly, the primary lien on this estate. My conglomerate initiated a hostile takeover of that equity firm 3 weeks ago. We didn't just purchase the debt, Richard. We purchased the authority to enforce it. The silence that descended upon the ballroom was so heavy it felt physical. I watched as the color drained from my mother's face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll about to shatter. Penelope stepped forward, her mouth opening, but no sound came out. She was watching her inheritance, her lifestyle, and her future being liquidated in real time. I looked at them not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. "You thought you could force me to sign away my home?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor. "You thought I would be the sacrificial lamb to save your house of cards. But you didn't realize that while you were busy trying to take my home, I was already in the process of taking your entire world." I leaned down until I was level with my father's face, my gaze locked firmly into his. "You sold your soul for a chance to belong to an elite class that never actually wanted you. You sold your daughter for a chance to brag at the country club. And now the bill has come due." I reached out and flipped the folder open. Inside were not just documents, but a series of legal notices detailing the foreclosure of the estate and the immediate liquidation of Titan's remaining assets. "I didn't just sell my code. Dad," I said, my voice quiet, cold, and absolute. "I bought your debt. I own the mortgage on this house. I own the outstanding liabilities of Titan. I own your company, your house, and every single cent of equity you thought you were building. You are currently sitting in a room that belongs to me, eating dinner that I paid for, hosted by a company that is legally mine." Jackson, from his pathetic position on the floor, let out a raw, guttural groan, clutching his head, as if he were trying to physically pull his own thoughts out of his skull. Penelope looked at me, her eyes brimming with a mixture of terror and realization. She finally understood that the person she had spent 35 years mocking was the one who now held the keys to her entire life. "You have 48 hours to vacate this property," I stated, my voice echoing as the realization hit every single person in the room. "The local authorities have been notified that this is a private asset currently in the middle of a transition. If you are not off the premises by the time the sun rises on the second day, I will have the sheriff's department remove you for trespassing on my land." Brenda finally snapped. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm, her touch frantic and desperate. "Kendall, please, you can't do this. We're your family. Think about what the neighbors will say. Think about our reputation." I felt no warmth from her touch, only the cold, dry skin of a woman who had never truly known love for anything other than her own image. I pulled my arm away carefully, wiping the spot where she had touched me. "Your reputation is already dust, Mom. The neighbors are currently watching your social standing evaporate right in front of them. As for family, you abandoned that title the moment you chose to sell me out for Jackson's fake prosperity. You aren't my family. You're just tenants in a building I'm about to tear down." I turned away from them, leaving them in the wreckage of their own making. I walked toward the bar where the remaining guests were staring at me as if I were a ghost. The power dynamic had been obliterated. There was no more golden child, no more scapegoat, only the woman who had managed to escape the gravity of their toxicity and come back to reclaim the spoils of her own survival. I looked back one last time. Richard had fallen silent, his eyes fixed on the spilled wine across the table. Penelope was standing perfectly still, her face drained of all color, staring at the folder as if it were a death warrant. And Jackson was still on the floor, shivering, completely destroyed by the weight of his own crimes and the sheer, overwhelming reality of his failure. It was time to finish this. The destruction of their financial reality was complete, but the final, most satisfying blow was yet to come. I walked over to the sound system, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, and looked at the terrified sound technician who was cowering behind his board. I told him to cut the feed. I had one final announcement, one that would ensure that even if they managed to crawl away from this, they would never be able to hold their heads up in Palo Alto again. They had wanted the world to see their perfect family, and I was going to ensure that the world saw exactly who they were. I picked up the microphone, the feedback from the speakers sending a sharp electric hum through the ballroom. The entire room went dead silent, waiting for the final words of the heiress who had just burned her own kingdom to the ground. Penelope lunged toward Jackson, her crimson gown blurring like a smear of fresh blood against the pristine marble. She didn't reach for him with affection or concern. She grabbed the lapels of his custom Italian suit and slammed him back against the dining table, the force of her movement sending crystal glasses shattering across the floor. Her face, usually a masterpiece of composure, was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "You lied to me!" she screamed, her voice losing its polished, Harvard-educated cadence, devolving into a raw, guttural shriek that silenced the entire room. "You told me we were building an empire. You told me our finances were locked tight. You bought me diamonds with money you stole from investors, and you let me walk around this ballroom acting like a queen while you were secretly planning our absolute destruction." Jackson didn't even try to fight back. He slumped under her assault, his eyes glazed with the terrifying reality that his entire facade had completely crumbled. He was no longer the visionary tech mogul. He was just a desperate, pathetic man who had gambled away his wife's future and lost. "I did it for us," he choked out his voice, a pathetic, wheezing rasp. "I did it because I needed to be the man you deserved. I needed to be the winner this family demanded." Penelope shoved him away with such force that he collapsed back onto the floor, the heavy fabric of his suit torn at the shoulder. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with the cold, sharp gaze of a woman who had just realized she had been tied to a sinking anchor. She didn't care about his desperate need for approval. She cared about the fact that her designer lifestyle, her social standing, and her comfortable future were currently being liquidated by a woman she had spent 35 years devaluing. Brenda, meanwhile, had completely abandoned her icy, sophisticated facade. She had collapsed onto her knees on the cold marble, her expensive gown bunched up around her waist, her face smeared with ruined makeup. She crawled toward me, her hands outstretched in a desperate, pleading gesture, her voice rising in a high-pitched, manic sob. "Kendall, please," she wailed, grabbing the hem of my evening gown. "You don't understand. We're family. We made mistakes, yes, but family is about forgiveness. We can start over. We can be the family we were always meant to be. Just give us a second chance. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Just tell Elias to stop the liquidation. Please, Kendall, for the sake of the mother who raised you." I looked down at her, seeing the woman who had systematically destroyed my confidence for 3 decades. I saw the mother who had hidden my acceptance letters, the woman who had told me I was a failure because I didn't fit into her manufactured image of success. I felt absolutely no warmth, no sympathy, and certainly no desire to forgive. I reached down and violently ripped my gown out of her grasp, the sound of the silk tearing slightly as I stepped away from her. "Do not ever touch me again," I said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "You talk about forgiveness as if you have any idea what it means. You spent 33 years teaching me that love was conditional, that affection was a transaction, and that my worth was determined by how well I served your vanity. You didn't raise me, Brenda. You tolerated me while you built your own pedestal. You treated me like a broken tool because I wouldn't let you dictate the shape of my life." I walked toward the center of the room, feeling the absolute weight of my own autonomy for the first time in my life. I had spent so long seeking the approval of people who were incapable of giving it. I had spent so long trying to fix a relationship that was fundamentally built on my own destruction. This isn't about forgiveness, I said, addressing not just my mother but the entire room of silent, stunned spectators. This is about accountability. You created this dynamic. You fostered this cruelty. You watched your favorite child push me down, mock my intellect, and strip me of my agency, and you applauded it because it kept your own sense of superiority intact. You don't want a second chance at being a family. You want a second chance at controlling the narrative so you can pretend you weren't the ones who created this mess. I reached into the leather folder I had taken from Elias and pulled out a stack of crisp, heavy documents. I didn't hand them to my father. I tossed them onto the ruined dining table, the papers fanning out across the spilled wine and the broken china. Those are legally binding 48-hour eviction notices, I announced, my voice steady and cold. I have officially terminated the lease on this estate, and because I now own the underlying debt, I have also secured the permits for immediate property reclamation. The moment you leave, the demolition crews arrive. This house, this monument to your vanity, this fortress of expectations I could never meet, is going to be leveled to the ground. Richard looked up from the table, his eyes wide and vacant. Demolished. You can't demolish this house. It's been in our family for 20 years. It's the center of our legacy. Your legacy is a fraud, Richard. I replied, refusing to soften the blow. Your legacy is built on stolen money, toxic expectations, and the systematic devaluing of the people who actually loved you. I don't want a legacy that was built on the ruins of my own self-worth. I want a blank slate. Penelope stood up, her face a mask of cold, calculated fury. You think you've won, don't you? You think buying a house and destroying a company makes you a person? You're still nothing. You're still the little girl who didn't get into the school she wanted. You're still the bitter, jealous child who had to resort to corporate warfare just to feel like you belonged. I looked at her, finally seeing her for exactly what she was, a frightened, insecure woman who had nothing without the stolen validation of her husband and parents. You're right, Penelope, I said, my voice quiet and absolute. I am that little girl. But I grew up. I learned how to build something real. You spent your life playing the role of the golden child, so you never had to learn how to exist without someone else's approval. That's why you're falling apart right now. Because for the first time in your life, you are looking at yourself in the mirror, and you have absolutely no idea who is looking back. I turned my back on them, walking toward the grand entrance where Elias Thorne was waiting. I didn't need to look back to see them falling apart. I could hear it. I could hear my mother sobbing on the floor. I could hear my father arguing with the legal documents. And I could hear Penelope shouting at Jackson, trying to pin the blame on him for her own crumbling reality. It was a symphony of chaos, a beautiful, necessary destruction. As I reached the grand doors, I paused, looking back one final time at the scene of my own emancipation. They were no longer the powerful, intimidating figures who had controlled my life for 33 years. They were just people. They were small, broken, and fundamentally lost. They had tried to destroy me, and in doing so, they had accidentally forced me to become the one person they were most afraid of, a woman who didn't need them. I didn't offer a final goodbye. I didn't offer a word of comfort. I simply walked out of the ballroom through the massive mahogany doors and into the cool, refreshing air of the night. I had finally severed the final chain. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the failure. I was the architect of my own life, and for the first time in 33 years, the future was entirely my own to build. The demolition of the estate was just the beginning. I had a lot of work to do, but the hardest part was finally behind me. I was free. 6 months have passed since that night at the Palo Alto estate, and the landscape of my life, as well as the lives of those who once sought to destroy me, has shifted beyond recognition. Time has a way of stripping away the illusions we carefully construct to hide our true nature, and for my former family, the reality of their choices has finally settled in with the cold, hard weight of concrete. Jackson is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal penitentiary in the heart of the Mojave Desert. The trial was not the grand dramatic media circus he had envisioned for himself. There were no cameras documenting his visionary genius, no investors clamoring for interviews, and certainly no adoring crowds waiting for his release. There was only a stern judge, a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence that I had personally compiled, and the hollow realization that his charisma could not manipulate a sentencing guideline. He is currently learning the harsh reality of life, without a silk suit, spending his days in a cramped cell, stripped of the influence and the stolen status he once wielded like a weapon. Every time he checks his bank account, he is met with a zero balance, a constant reminder that the empire he promised to build was nothing more than a carefully crafted digital lie that ultimately collapsed under the scrutiny of the law. Penelope, meanwhile, has been forced to confront a world that does not care about her Harvard pedigree or her social connections in the elite Palo Alto circles. She is currently working a grueling 12-hour shift at a discount retail warehouse on the outskirts of the city. She spends her days standing on her feet processing returns and shelving merchandise for customers who have absolutely no idea that she once believed she was destined for a life of private jets and luxury islands. Her designer gowns are long gone, sold off in the frantic weeks following the estate liquidation to pay for her initial legal fees. She lives in a shared studio apartment with peeling wallpaper and a drafty window, a stark contrast to the sprawling mansion she once claimed as her birthright. The social circle that once celebrated her every move has completely abandoned her, viewing her association with Jackson's fraud as a stain on their own reputations. She has become a ghost in the world she once desperately wanted to rule, a woman whose entire identity was based on the reflected light of a man who ultimately dragged her down into the dirt with him. As for my parents, Richard and Brenda, their descent has been perhaps the most tragic to witness. They are living in a cramped, moldy apartment in a part of the city they wouldn't have even driven through 6 months ago. The estate was leveled exactly as I promised, and the land was reclaimed for the server farm infrastructure that now fuels the Aegis encryption network. My father, once the powerful patriarch of a real estate dynasty, spends his days arguing with insurance adjusters and trying to scrape together enough cash for basic necessities. The country club, the elite social clubs, the high-end galas, all of it is gone. They were formally blacklisted from their social circles the moment the federal indictments against Jackson went public. They are entirely exiled from the world they worshipped, forced to exist in the quiet, stifling reality of their own limited means. Every now and then, my phone rings from a blocked number. It's usually my mother, Brenda, her voice thick with self-pity, begging for a moment of my time, claiming she just wants to talk, just wants to make amends, just wants to explain that she didn't mean for things to turn out this way. I listen to the first few seconds, hearing the desperate, trembling tone of a woman who has finally realized she is alone, and then I simply press the block button. There is no anger left in me for her, only a profound, liberating indifference. The woman who once held the power to destroy my confidence with a single glance no longer has the ability to influence my heart rate. I have disconnected the emotional tether, and the silence that follows is the most peaceful sound I have ever known. I am currently standing on the balcony of my penthouse in Manhattan. The air is crisp, biting with the promise of winter, but the warmth of my home radiates behind me, a space I designed specifically for my own comfort, not for the approval of others. The skyline stretches out before me, an endless horizon of lights and opportunity, a far cry from the pale blue walls of the bedroom I was forced to inhabit as a child. I have taken the $50 million from the acquisition and reinvested it into a new, smaller, more agile security software firm that I run on my own terms. I am no longer fixing other people's problems, and I am certainly no longer acting as the collateral for other people's greed. There is a powerful, almost spiritual freedom in cutting off toxic DNA. For years, I was told that family was the most important thing, that loyalty was an unconditional requirement, regardless of how much you were being hurt. But I have learned that loyalty without respect is just a gilded cage. You don't owe your peace to anyone, especially not to the people who were supposed to protect it. It takes an incredible amount of courage to walk away from the people who raised you, to admit that the love you were looking for was never going to be given, and to build a life on your own terms. I don't look back at the wreckage with longing. I don't harbor any regrets about the way I handled the dissolution of my family's empire. I did what I had to do to survive. I did what I had to do to reclaim my agency. And in the process, I discovered that I was always capable of building something far more resilient than the fragile, status obsessed life they were selling. My worth was never defined by their opinion of me, and it was never determined by their ability to provide for me. I am the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in my 33 years, I am truly completely free. But I know I am not the only one who has had to make these difficult decisions. I know that there are so many of you out there listening, perhaps in the middle of your own battles with toxic relatives, wondering if it's worth it to walk away, wondering if you are doing the right thing by protecting your boundaries. It is never easy to set these lines in the sand, but I promise you the view from the other side is worth every single ounce of pain it takes to get there. Before I go, I want to ask you a question, and I truly want you to be honest with yourself about the answer. Have you ever had to let your family hit rock bottom to protect your own peace? Have you ever had to stand back and watch the house you were raised in burn to the ground because it was the only way to save yourself? It's a heavy question, I know, but sometimes the most difficult path is the only one that leads to true freedom. Let me know your stories in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I know how much power there is in sharing our experiences, in finding that we are not as alone as we think we are. And if this journey resonated with you, if it gave you the spark of courage you needed to set your own boundaries, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We are building a community here based on resilience, on growth, and on the absolute undeniable power of taking back your own life. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and thank you for being the kind of person who is willing to stand up for their own worth. Remember, your story is yours to write, and every single plot twist is just another opportunity for you to step into the life you are meant to live. Don't let anyone hold you back. Don't let anyone dictate your value, and above all, never settle for a version of family that doesn't respect the person you have worked so hard to become. Stay strong, keep your boundaries impenetrable, and always, always keep your receipts. The most profound lesson from Kendall's journey is that true worth is never determined by those who seek to diminish us. For years, she allowed her family's conditional love to shape her identity, believing she was the failure because she didn't fit their shallow, status-obsessed narrative. However, by embracing her own intelligence and boundaries, she reclaimed her autonomy. No one has the power to define your potential unless you give it to them. Protecting your peace is not an act of cruelty, but one of survival and self-respect. Have you ever had to walk away to find your own worth? Comment below.